intro with you. I'm not going to do a massive intro, but
No. Sorry.
Okay, everybody. I think we're all back from lunch, a little later than scheduled, but hey, these things are always movable feasts. So I won't do too much of an introduction because I don't want to ruin her. Whatever you're going to say. So I'll just hand you over to Lynn, and she's going to talk to us about those who left and those who arrived and those who stayed.
Yes, those who arrived wasn't originally in the title, but I suddenly realised that I'd missed out some people, so I better put it in. So the pictures that I'm using, the obvious 19th century pictures which are in here, are courtesy of Long Melford Historical and Archaeological Society. And I've been involved in studying Melford's population for getting on for 30 years. Don't ask me why, but I have. And that includes developing a population reconstruction, which started off as a family reconstitution, and then adding in data any data that I could find from any source that I could find. I used that in a master's that I did part-time while I was working, and then after I retired, I decided I'd do a PhD and used it for that as well. Both of those, in a way, concentrated on the stable part of the population. But if you're counting, and I was counting, so it is figures, if you're counting stability, you're also counting migration and mobility, so you just have to turn things round a bit. So what I want to do today is to give you a bit of introduction and then tell you about two related bits of work. First one about mobility and stability amongst couples, which is largely what the PhD was all about. And then secondly, a comparison of 3 cohorts of children brought up in Melford. The reason, if I'm comparing across a 200-year period, which I am, the reason I concentrated on couples is because basically you don't have the same evidence about single adults. You know, couples turn up far more often in the records, particularly if they're having children or they're householders or whatever. Single adults don't appear with the same frequency, and you cannot accurately compare across time with single adults. So Melford, not that very far away from here. It's not that shape, but it's that shape. Southwest Suffolk, on the Suffolk-Essex border. That border is the River Stour. Melford is immediately north of Sudbury, which is an ancient borough and nowadays a small to medium-sized town. And it's about 12 miles south of Bury St Edmunds. So as I said, not that far away. These days called a large village or an urban village, but through the period I'm talking about today, people thought of it as a small town. It is physically quite large for the area. It's not large for a parish in Lancashire, but for East Anglia, 5,000 plus acres is quite large. So farmland was always important, agriculture is always important, but from the early to mid 14th century, it's also a textile area. And first of all producing broadcloth, and then from the late 16th century, it got into bays and says, what are called the new draperies. That carried on, went into decline during the 18th century, and very hard times at the end of the 18th century, and also very hard times immediately after the Napoleonic Wars, which is, most of eastern and southern England had really hard times after the Napoleonic Wars. From Melford's point of view, new industries arrived from the 1830s and helped create a recovery that lasted for the rest of the century, basically. And the population, these figures are the census. This is through the 19th century. my educated guesstimate, I think is the right phrase, is about 1,500 people in the 1670s. There are particularly good sources of information about population in the late 17th century. So I think that's roughly right. And the dotted line is, again, my educated guesstimate as to what the population was in the interim. The national population history suggests that there's a sort of flat bit from after the Civil War through to about the middle of the 18th century, and then population growth started again right across the country. So no reason why Melford should be any different from anywhere else. I thought I'd just sort of think about, just very briefly, about who migrants are likely to be, migrants in and migrants out. In most places, if we're talking about this country, and large and internal migration, there's more mobility among single people. Single young people move more than couples do. Not true everywhere, all the time, but in general they do. So you're always, a proportion of your children are moving out of your place to wherever. What proportion that is depends on the economy and the population of your place. But your place is also receiving in other people's children who are coming in for service or apprenticeship or whatever. So there's always that fairly rapid turnover of single young people. And there's always another turnover of couples, and which in many places is slower than the turnover amongst young people, because we know that lots of servants, spent 1 year in a place and then moved on, etc. So I think the migration amongst couples, again, obviously has to relate to the economy of the place and the population and the variety of industry and the variety of occupation that it's offering. So you get this continual turnover amongst some parts of the population and more stability amongst other parts. So when I was doing my PhD, I was interested in stability, and I was interested in quite long-term stability. So I decided to measure on two different ways. I measured family background in the place. So first of all, what I've called third generation, people who had grandparents there. As a reasonable, most people will know who their grandparents were, even if they never met them. So 3 generations, and also 2 gens, so people who'd had parents there, but not grandparents. And when I looked at couples, I called, if one partner in a couple was one of those, say 3rd generation, the couple was, I typed them that way. But also, there's all the people who move in. And there's also the issue of time. So I then worked out how long people spent in the place that I got evidence of after the age of 15, so from 16 upwards. And I used this measure of 30 years as a sort of, people who spent a considerable proportion of their adult lives in this place. So I counted that for couples as well. And obviously, lots of the people who'd had family background there were also met this 30-year measure. But there's also the newcomers, and for Melford, there's always a proportion of newcomer couples who stay. So for each generation, some of them stay, and then their children stay, and they are joining your stable part of your community. And then, of course, there's the others, the people who came and went in less than 30 years and didn't have any family link with the place. And I looked in these 3.5 periods, actually. So late 17th century, which is period A, mid to late 18th century, B, and that 19th century period, C. And that was determined by record sources. not the stuff that's right across the piece, like the parish registers and things, but in each of those periods, I've got additional sources that give me a bit, extra information. That period, which is the first few years of that 19th century one, is there because when I was measuring time, I've got a real problem because my database finishes at 1861. So if I was looking at young couples in the 1850s, for example, I cannot tell accurately how many of them were still there 30 years later. So I realised that if I looked at the people who were there in the early 1830s, which is more than half of the total, I could do those more I could get better results on that. So anything where I'm looking at things to do with time in the 19th century, I use that smaller group. So there are tables in this, but never mind, they're all right. This is looking at what proportion of couples met those stability criteria. The deepest, what is meant to be deep blue, but looks sludgy grey colour on here, are the proportion of couples in each period who at least one partner had grandparents in the parish. So they're that level of stability. And that went up from about 40% in the late 17th century to it's about 55% in relation to the couples who were there in the early 1830s. And it's a bit higher in the 1851 census, but there's a statistical problem about comparing a census with longer periods, which, if anybody's interested, I can tell you about. So you've got this general gradual increase in the proportion of couples where at least one of them has got a reasonable family background in the parish. The paler blue is the second generation, the ones whose parents were there. And then the paler pink is the 30-year only, the people who had come in from outside, but they stayed. And then the deeper red is the others. So you've got, by the time you get to the 1851 census, you've got 70% of the population where at least one partner in each couple had got a family background in the parish. So you've got that increase over time. This is time. Comes to 30. It's about 30 years.
Lynn,
yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Back on that previous chart.
Yeah.
Was the 100% out of all who stayed, or out of
everybody
in the
yes.
the town?
Yes.
So
Sorry.
you only had about 20% moving out.
By the time you get you have people. No, let's.
Sorry.
It's a perfectly good question. Amongst these people who'd got, a family background there, I'll show you something in a minute about the proportion of them who moved out.
Okay.
Amongst this lot, this people, the people who were there came in and stayed, tended to stay for rather than move again. If they'd stayed for 30 years, they by and large stayed. Amongst this lot, again, we'll look at it a bit more in a minute. Amongst the people who are coming and going, I'll show you something in a minute. That's the best way to speak. In relation to time overall, so this is couples who the time spent after the age of 15 by the longest surviving partner in a couple. And that's the 17th century, that's the 19th century. The sludgy grey colour is 30 years. The deepest red colour is under 10 years. And so you've got 10 to 19 and 20 to 29 years. So at any period, you've only got, for this one particular place, you've got less than 20% of all couples who are in that under 10-year period. If anybody wants to ask me about how many people I think I know about compared to how many people who I might know about, or I don't know about, then that's another question. Ask Alfie.
This isn't just people living longer.
You're just for deaths.
Oh, sorry. By the time you get to here, which is good, I should have mentioned that. By the time you get to the 19th century, adult mortality is falling, adult life expectancy is going up. So there is that, the 30-year sort of measure is, by the time you get to the 19th century, the earlier, it's fairly stable, it's not changing. So there is that amount, that influence. If you're looking over time, we've always got to be aware of, long-term demographic changes. Because, I mean, one of the other things that's happening, doesn't matter to this, but might do if you're looking at some other things, is that the age of marriage is going down between the late 17th century and the 19th century. So when you're looking at, for example, the proportion of people where their parents are alive while they were married, if you see what I mean, that increases quite, I'm not going to show you that, but that increases quite a lot. And partly that is going to be that background demographic change, that marriage is younger. So it's always that, so there's movement, but there's a lot of stability as well. So I think you get a lot of stability amongst the same, people move in and out, and then other people move in and out. But the stable part of this particular place is quite large. And given that in this period, it's an active and successful manufacturing town, this period it is in decline as a manufacturing town. This period is about to sort of be a manufacturing town again. You've got that sort of background as well, because that affects how many people you've got coming in, etc. So these are third generation couples. So couples, again, at least one of them in each couple had grandparents there. 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, the sludgy grey colour is couples where at least one of them was there for 30 years. So amongst those couples, there's a very high proportion of those couples spend a lot of their lifetime there. But what about the newcomers? That's it. This is newcomers over the same periods. About 40%-ish of newcomer couples, at least one of them is there for 30 years. Somewhere, it's about a maximum of just 30% or just over, where I've got evidence for less than 10 years. So it's, as I said, each generation you're gaining stable people from the newcomers of the previous generation. But at the same time, you've got people coming and going all the time. So that's that. Then I looked at social structure, and I did a four-way analysis. Melford is quite well gentried, if you can, if that's a word. So the social group 1 was the gentry and the richest of everybody else. Social group 2 was the big farmers, and most of the farmers were farming large acreages. The major manufacturers, clothiers or manufacturers of other things, and the professionals, because there are always professionals around, the rector, the attorney, the doctor, etc., and more of them in the 19th century. Social group 3, craftsmen and tradesmen, largely, and their families, and smaller farmers when there were any. And social group 4, those who are from an unskilled or a semi-skilled background, and the paupers, of course. The social structure in general didn't change very much over time. What happened was, these are the top 2 social groups here. These are proportions of all couples, and they felt that that they became a smaller proportion of the population overall. The social group 3, craftsmen and tradesmen, stayed fairly steady. The grey bit over here is the people I don't know about in the 17th century. And most of them, I'm sure, were in social groups 3 or 4. Because as you know more about the people at the top of the scale because they leave wills and they pay taxes and such things. And I'm fairly convinced that the social structure didn't change much between the 17th and the 18th century. And by the time we get to the 19th century, the top ends carried on reducing, and social group 4 couples are accounting for about just under 50% of the total. So, how did that relate to stability? And I put a headline up there that says experiences got more different. What you've got here, this is the late 17th century, that's the 19th. Social group 1 down to social group 4. This pinky colour is people who've got a family background in the parish. The blue is people who came in and stayed. And the red is the people who came in and didn't stay. And at the end of the 17th century, the experience of every social group looks fairly similar. By the time you get to the 19th century, that's not true anymore. You know, the experience within the top social groups, you've got half of them are people who come in from the outside and don't stay very long. Whereas in the bottom social group, round about 70–75% are amongst the stable. So you've got that change. And if I had shown you the 18th century in the middle, it would look much more like the 17th century. And when I did work on kinship, which obviously is very closely allied to stability, exactly the same thing happened. If I'd showed you that in relation to the proportion of couples who had kin in Melford, you get exactly the same thing. It's very similar across the different social groups in the 17th century. By the time you get to the 19th century, kinship is concentrated down here and not in the top end of the social structure. And finally, I'll talk. When I just thought I'd put something in about kinship. When I was looking at kinship, I asked several questions. The first one was, for every couple, during the time that they were living in this place as a couple, were they related to any other couple or any other single adult? So that's the first question. Did they have any kin or not? Second question was, if they did have kin, how many during the course of their married lives? And the third question then got into what sort. Was it parents? Was it second cousins? You know, who were they related to? And I haven't got time to go into that in detail. But what this relates to is the average number of kin links per couple in different social groups in the different periods. So in the 17th century period, the average number of kinship links I could find across the piece was just over 4. Yeah, average per. This is of the couples who did have links, okay, because before, yeah. Was 4, and the yellow is the 17th century, and here are the different social groups. And you can see that there's a bit of difference. Those in social group 2 had a few more. But by and large, it's similar across the different social groups. The blue is the 18th century, and again, not that different across the different social groups. And the average across the whole piece, in the 18th century, the average was 6.5, something like that. When you get to the 19th century, which is the red, you can see this very different picture. That the average kinship, average number of other people, other couples, etc., that people were related to had gone up to nearly 16. And it's concentrated in the bottom parts of the social structure. My winner was a couple who, during the course of their lifetime in Melford, were related to 81 other couples or single adults in that parish. And they both came, obviously, from big local families. It's the sort of increasing concentration on big local families that in some ways that changed, that change in pattern between the 17th century and the 19th century about stability and things. The 19th century picture looks quite sensible if you think about lots of 19th century records about places. We have very stable agricultural labouring community, for example, and lots of gentry and other people from outside. What I was surprised by is how different the earlier periods were, that it wasn't like that earlier on. So you get this very high level of kinship increase. Now that partly relates to life expectancy. It also and family sizes, yes, and well, which relates to life expectancy and infant mortality, etc. Your infant mortality infant mortality is sort of goes down quite strongly at the early 19th century once they started in smallpox vaccination, because that killed lots of children. But it also, sorry, my brain's gone. There's something else it also relates to, but it'll come back to me later. So I've got this general picture of, looked at couples in all those sorts of ways, and a few more as well, but not for today. So after I'd finished my PhD, I thought, right, that's couple, I've done that, but what about the children? Going back to this business that by and large most people, there's a lot of migration is amongst the young and the single. What proportion of the overall people in this place am I actually looking at? So I then set up myself another set of spreadsheets, looking at all the children born to those couples who were under 16 at some point in the individual period that I was dealing with. And I took out all the children who died before 16. So I've taken out infant mortality and childhood mortality. Some of the people you've got left, and the numbers are down there, some of the people you've got left will have actually left with their parents when they were very young, and you don't know that. But some of them are the people who become the stable later. And there's issues in here that relate to comparing over time as well, which I'll get to in a minute. So the second line here is actually I call these people children. Some of them died when they were 95 or something, but they are the children of the couples that I've been working with. And it said, no evidence of their burial before 16. Around about a third of each cohort of children were actually themselves buried in the parish, which obviously implies that 2/3 gone somewhere else. And it's just slightly smaller percentages of the proportion who lived in Melford while they were married. Didn't necessarily die there, but they lived there at some point in their in their married lives. Now, those two lines you can reasonably compare across time because you're dealing with parish registers and other things which are continuous. There's other stuff that you can't accurately compare because the records are different. And when I started looking at, for example, this line, which is people from I've got some evidence of them over 16, whether they're married or single, but they weren't buried there. You've got this 20%-ish in each of the two earlier periods, and then much more in the 19th century. And the reason for that is the censuses. The censuses give you much more information about single adults and also couples who stay locally for a while, don't have any children, and then move on. And equally, this line, which is the people where there's no evidence of them at all. And those results relate entirely to different, well, not necessarily entirely, but certainly partly in relation to different sources. So it's that being very careful about what your sources you're using, and not trying to compare two things which don't, you've got information from different places. And the final thing that I did was to then look at the people who were the children. I said some of them died in their 90s, but I'm still calling them children. These third of the population in relation to where their parents were buried. So where both parents were buried in Melford, you've got, it's 40 plus a bit of their children who were also buried there. Where one parent was buried, it comes down, and where neither parent was buried there, it's much smaller. There's a lot. Melford is quite a pleasant sort of place to live if you're reasonably off. There's always lots of textile towns, there's always lots of poor people. But there are lots of women who marry in. It must be the same in most. Lots of people who marry in who, when they're widowed, either they marry somewhere else or they go back to where they came from in the first place and take their children with them. Which helps explain that, I think. I think if I hadn't taken out the children who died young, that might look more different. And that's where I got to. And I don't know how I'm doing for time, but that's where I'm finishing. Thank you. Oh, and I'll go on one because there's some pretty pictures. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, no, I forgot about this. I had some conclusions. How common was Melford's experience? This is a middle-sized small town. First of all, I don't know, because the indicators that I was using, this third generation business and the 30 years, nobody else has used. So I can't compare directly. Population size and the local economy have to have these major effects on people who move in and out, and what proportion. If a lot of the early academic work that got done on family reconstitutions were on small arable parishes, which were actually physically small as well, they didn't offer a variety of employment, and they didn't offer as many marriage partners. And also they're smaller physically. So, I mean, if you live in the middle of Melford, you can in several directions go 4 or 5 miles and you're still in Melford. Whereas if you're living in a small agricultural parish and you hop over the border, then if you're lost to a one-place study. Melford also offered employment to women and children through a lot of the period that I have been thinking about. Both when it was a textile town, so spinning for women, and then the 19th century industries offered lots of work for women and children. And I'm sure that had an effect. If you are an agricultural labourer, but you're living somewhere where your wife and your children can fairly easily get work, you think more carefully about moving to somewhere else where you could work as an agricultural labourer, but there isn't any work for the rest of the family. I know somebody who did doing some large-scale work for like the whole country on the 1881 census, and he was looking at married women working. And I know that there's all sorts of issues about married women working in the census, but he basically found that the textile areas always had the highest proportion of married women working. The mining areas always have virtually the lowest. But there's not a lot in between. That there were lots of parts of the country by the 1880s where there was very little work for married women. So the textile and related sort of industries that did offer work, you know, were creating a different sort of local economy maybe. And obviously, places with fast-growing populations or constant high levels of in-migration will, of course, be different. But what I would like is another place of its own, of that size, to compare. But very few people are as daft as I am to spend 30 years fiddling around and putting this all together. Right, and now I have got some pretty pictures. There we are, or some unpretty pictures. Yeah. That's Kentwell and that's Melford Hall. It's said it's quite highly gentried, Melford, if that's a verb. Though the main of the 19th century industries were horsehair weaving in particular, horsehair, or stuffing railway seats with horsehair, anything you could do with horsehair. But there was also coir matting, which is that, and flax, which I think those are amongst the flax workers. The flax workers tend to be more male, horsehair workers tend to be very highly female. But,
I've got a couple of questions. One, you said that you used a variety of sources
Yes.
that were not parish registered.
Yeah.
For each of your periods, what were the main?
Right. My list of sources is 4 A4 pages long.
Really?
Right. Because I've included every little anything I ever found. The things that go across the periods are the parish registers, wills, and there is manorial evidence that's across the 3 periods. The extra sources that are particularly useful extra sources, going backwards, the 19th century was the censuses basically, and a couple of very good valuations, etc. The 18th century is poor rating evidence and poor relief evidence.
Oh, because you were in later 18th, okay.
Well, right across, well, from the 1750s on. And because Melford and its next door neighbour did something a bit odd, which I've not found other places, but if anybody's looked at, I don't know if anybody's looked at poor rates, what normally you have is your top whatever percentage is of the local inhabitants, and they are charged a percentage on the value of their land, or their houses or property. What Melford does as well is charge a penny a time for every time they rate. They charge all the cottagers, all the people who live in cottages, a penny a time.
Oh, super.
And that's probably about double the number of households that there are actual ratepayers. So you get huge, and they tell you which street they're living in as well, which is really useful. So you get evidence that those people are there, and their social status to an extent, and that's really, that comes in as really useful. And there's only one little period where I've got that sort of evidence and the evidence of them paying poor relief in the same year, And when I put it all together, there are some people who are not in either list, but it's relatively small. It's, these, because of that particular source. And the 17th century, I was saying to Peter earlier, I think it was, wasn't it? There was a rector. He was called Nathaniel Bisbee, who was rector of Melford for 30 years in the late 17th century. And I think I would have probably disliked him intensely as a person, but from a distance, I can like him because he wrote everything down in big books that survive. And he, at Easter, everybody paid 2p a head across the country, as far as I know. You paid 2p a head to your local rector or vicar, called different things in different places, Easter offerings or other things. And there are 5 lists for Melford in the 1670s to 80s of house by house, street by street. Everybody, you can work out how many people there are over 16 because they're all paying 2p a head. And you know exactly where they're living. And it's, you know, how many, it doesn't name the servants, but you can work out how many servants and things there are as well. So that gives me a lot more evidence of the young single people for that period. Whereas in the 18th century, my evidence of young single people is the mothers of bastard children, because they're getting poor relief. I know far more single women in the 18th century because they're getting poor relief because they've had illegitimate children than I do about single men. And that's the sort of thing you can't compare. You know, they're not measuring the same thing. So that's that difficulty.
The other question that I had was, and you may have covered this, but you know where you showed the difference in kinship links?
Yes.
In the later
yes.
centuries.
Yeah.
Why do you think that change took? I couldn't
Yes.
really grasp why would something like that happen?
Before the late 17th century, if you start further back, there's much more, you know, it's generally accepted that there's much more migration in the 16th century and the first part of the 17th century within the country. You know, late 17th century, it slows down through to mid 18th century maybe. It doesn't stop, of course it doesn't, but it slows down. So the people who are there in the late 17th century are the children and grandchildren of a lot of migrants, probably, when it was a, you know, richest period as a textile town. So, which might explain there's more migration amongst their parents and their grandparents' generations, explains less kinship in, you know, at that period. But because you've got stable, a good proportion of stable couples carrying on, then every generation you get more relations. Right. And when I looked at, you know, when they're talking about kinship, people talk about first order kinship, which is, you know, being related to your parents or your siblings or your children, your own children. And in the 17th century period, 70% of all the kin links I could count were to first order kin. In the 19th century, 70% of all the couples who, no, I got that last bit wrong. In the 17th century, 70% of couples who had kin links only had them to close kin. In the 19th century, 70% of all the couples had kin links had them to more distant kin as well. I think it's down to siblings, basically. If you start getting more, if you try and put families together, anybody who's done it when you sort of earlier place, you tend to get one or two children who stay, and you don't know anything about the later ones. By the early 19th century, I've got families where I know something about virtually all of them, because they've all stayed. And you only need a few, you know, siblings to stay in one generation, and you've got the most, you know, your kinship density goes all over the place. So it's this sort of gradual build-up of the stable get more stable, and then they have more kin. Whether or not they liked each other, whether they liked their relations, whether they made use of their relations, who knows? But, you know, they've got the potential. If you've got, in the 19th century period, quite a lot of my families in the lower social groups have got 40 or 50 kin links that I can find you've got the potential to make use of relationships and them to make use of you. That isn't there if, you know, and that makes living somewhere it can make it different. But I mean, actually, so I think there's, you know, it's somewhere around there. Yeah.
It's interesting that you commented about the relative degree of migration in the late 17th century. Was that constant throughout the country? Because I haven't done anything detailed, but looking back at the Memorial Court records for our place in the 17th century, it's the same names at proper time and time again, with very little new ones coming in.
Yes, it depends on how many of your children are moving out, and
don't know that,
yes,
obviously, but I just want evidence that this is constant throughout the country. Is it very
I suspect it might be southern and eastern biased. That the work that was done in the 1980s, when migration sort of, when people started looking at this, to try and look at, people used, and where you couldn't get, you know, the censuses weren't available at that time and things. And a lot of the early work was done looking at church court records, because if people were taken to the church court, you had to, before you gave evidence, you did a little, you know, there's a little history that says you were born in so-and-so, or you've lived so-and-so for 25 years, so you know what you're about, or whatever. And that sort of, using those and other, you know, and it was that sort of, and other related sorts of evidence, it was anything they could get their hands on. The textbooks say that there's less long distance migration by the late 17th century. And they also look at things like the apprenticeship records of London guilds and how far people are coming, or go, you know, well, come. But you know, it's difficult to know, but it's, you know, by the late 17th century. But it's, I mean, but that's internal migration, because nobody's, as far as I know, spent much time looking at the whys for this sort of population stability more after the Civil War through to the mid 18th century. But there's an awful lot of young men going to the colonies, particularly America, because of the indentured servant system. So there's a lot of single young men leaving and going to America. And there's more, I mean, this sort of relates, not quite, but, and there's more, there's a higher percentage of young people who don't marry, people who never married. That's the other thing that affects the comparison with later on, that the rate of marriage is much higher by the late 18th century, early 19th century than it is in the late 17th century. So that has an effect as well. But it's, I don't think, I mean, there's so little evidence. The other thing people have used is these very rare places where you can get, you've got lists. Oh gosh, do you want me to shut up? There's a couple of places in the late 17th century where in the same place there are two lists, some years apart, of the inhabitants. Cardington and anyhow, they both begin with C. Cook now and somewhere else. And in the 1970s, 1980s, when people first found these, and they looked at the turnover of surnames and names, and they got really shocked at the turnover because people sort of believed that nothing ever changed in the past. But then when people started looking at families, in fact, most, you know, a lot of that turnover is single people and such. And marriage means that you can lose surnames, but you know, there's still people from that family present, which is why you have to have, you know, count the women in and follow them as well, I think.
Well, thank you very much. I think we probably need to wrap up there.
Yes.
Ask the questions over coffee and things. We have got coffee and teas out there, and I think Kim's already told me that she has to have her time. So I think I'm going to be standing here again trying to stop you, I'm sorry.